Hello and welcome to lecture number 12. The information to be studied today includes an exploration of both American society and the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement between 1945 and 1961. This lecture is divided into three segments. The first will analyze the prosperity in the United States following World War II. It will address issues facing veterans and family life. The second portion will focus on the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. The lecture will also explore the other America, Americans who did not prosper following World War II. The previous lecture described events from 1945 to 61, and I included this slide showing Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. Well, the topics for today will cover the same time period, so these two men remained in the Oval Office during this era. We'll start with some statistics which characterize life in the so-called Affluent Society. Following World War II, the United States achieved the highest living standard in world history. Here are some statistics which characterized American families. 60% owned their own home. 3/4 of them owned their own car. Nearly 90% owned a television. On the left, we see a photograph of a young couple looking to purchase a house. This figure provides insight to the television revolution. The TV became incredibly popular, and it's estimated that by 1960, Americans had more televisions than bathrooms. Quality time with members of one's family might include watching The Ed Sullivan Show or a program produced by Walt Disney. Often, families ate dinner together, not at a table, but in front of the TV, with a frozen TV dinner placed atop a TV tray. Average time for viewing the television increased dramatically between 1950 and 1994. On the right, we see a figure of real gross national product factored for inflation, which demonstrates a clear and steady increase in the number of goods produced in the years following World War II. Average workers' income, adjusted for inflation, also increased by about 35% between 1945 and 1960. Next, we'll explore a policy which impacted veterans of the Second World War. In an effort to reward veterans of World War II and avoid a repeat of the bonus march of the early 1930s, near the end of the war, Congress passed the GI Bill, which in many ways fueled the prosperity following the Second World War. First of all, it included full tuition and spending money to veterans of World War II who wanted to go to school. Secondly, it offered loans. These were government-sponsored loans that were guaranteed up to $2,000. Third, there was money for the so-called 5220 Club. Veterans could receive unemployment insurance of $20 a week for up to a year. In many ways, this produced a social revolution in the United States as the middle class grew dramatically. However, the primary beneficiaries were white males. This wasn't designed to benefit white males at the expense of others. However, most veterans were male, and many colleges barred the entry of African Americans into their roles. Family life in this affluent society was unique. We'll explore this issue next. As more Americans became homeowners, they often drove their new cars on the new highway system and built their new houses in the suburbs rather than in inner cities. In what some have called the greatest internal migration in history, about 20 million Americans moved to the suburbs in the decade of the 1950s. This chart demonstrates the growth of American suburbs between 1940 and 1960. The percentage of people living in rural areas dropped from just under 50% in 1940 to about 36% in 1960, while the percentage of those living in the suburbs increased from about 19.5% in 1940 to over 30% in 1960. The previous slide showed how the location of the American family was transformed. Well, the size of the American family also increased in the years after World War II. There were a variety of factors that influenced this. First of all, Americans tended to marry at a younger age in the 1950s. About 1/3 of all women were married by the age of 19. The fertility rate was also increased, as we see with these comparative statistics from 1940 and 1957. It's estimated that in 1957, one American baby was born every 7 seconds. The baby boom generation is the name given to those who were born between 1946 and 64. About 76 million Americans were born during this era. As members of this generation move through each stage of life, they've had, and will continue to have, a major impact on American society. In the late 1940s, we see a spark in, among other things, sales of baby carriages. School construction increased in the 1950s, and in the 1960s we see college enrollments soaring. Baby boomers had many families, and so by the 1970s, house construction peaked. The 1980s and 90s saw a focus on retirement savings, and therefore an increase in the stock market. Experts predict in the future they will place a strain on the Social Security Trust Fund and the healthcare system. For this class, I'd like to discuss how the baby boom resulted in the development of a very unique youth culture. Many popular shows were geared toward teens and portrayed white suburban middle-class families like the Cleavers in Leave It to Beaver or the Nelsons in Ozzie and Harriet. Even Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz moved to the suburbs to raise their child. As they grew older, some teens rebelled against the traditional values associated with their parents, as reports of juvenile delinquency were rampant. Many blamed the new music young people found popular. It was rock and roll, as seen here with the image of Dick Clark's American Bandstand, which was a hit with this young baby boom generation. As teenagers had a great deal of disposable income in the 1950s, record sales tripled by the latter half of the decade. Possibly the most popular artist was Elvis Presley, whose lip smirk and pelvic gyrations were shocking to white middle-class parents. Millions tuned in when he first appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. His popularity among teens and condemnation by their parents foreshadowed a generational conflict which would characterize the 1960s. The modern civil rights movement also began during this era. We'll explore some background to its beginning first. World War II raised the expectations of many African Americans, as about 1 million blacks served in the armed forces during the war. Veterans who had served overseas returned from fighting fascism abroad and expected more racial equality at home. One symbolic shift came in 1947, when Major League Baseball saw its first black ballplayer since the decade of the 1890s. Jackie Robinson was the grandson of slaves. He had served in the military during the Second World War, and prior to that had attended college at UCLA. When he broke baseball's color barrier in 1947, he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers and became an immediate star. At the end of that season, he won the Rookie of the Year award. He was later named to the Baseball Hall of Fame. He became a role model for many young African Americans as well as whites. He was important because if the nation's pastime could become integrated, what about other aspects of American society? We also see the government beginning to recognize the negative impact of segregation and Jim Crow when Harry Truman established the first President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1947. For years, the NAACP had been slowly attacking segregation and Jim Crow with a series of court cases. In 1954, the Supreme Court was ready to take action. The important court case which was decided in 1954 has come to be known as the Brown decision. Linda Brown was a little girl who lived near a school in Kansas. However, she was prohibited from attending that school because she was black and the schools were segregated. There were a wide range of people who tried to change this system. However, I would like to mention two. The first was Thurgood Marshall. He was an attorney who worked for the NAACP, and he represented the Brown family. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, who lobbied the other justices to obtain a unanimous decision in this case. Below is a hyperlink to additional information about Linda Brown and her family. In 1954, the Supreme Court issued their ruling. Their decision struck down the concept of separate but equal in education, which had been in place since the 1890s. Furthermore, they declared that segregation in public schools was prohibited. Remember the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson? This was discussed in lecture number 4. This had established the separate but equal doctrine. Well, after the Brown decision, this no longer would be in place in education. It's really difficult to overestimate the impact of the Brown decision. Members of the African American community found that one segment of the government, the judicial branch, was actively fighting on their side. While other events came before it, in many ways, the Brown decision was the spark that started the modern civil rights movement. 1 year following the Brown decision, the Supreme Court ordered that schools be desegregated with all deliberate speed. However, many districts resisted. On the left, we see a photo of Elizabeth Eckford. She was one of the Little Rock Nine who attended Little Rock High School in 1957. Here we see her facing a mob on her way to attend the first day of school in that year. 40 years later, the woman shown in the picture shouting insults at her asked for forgiveness. Next, we'll investigate some of the events surrounding the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott was sparked by the actions of this woman, Rosa Parks. She refused to move to the back of the bus, which was segregated by law, when asked by the bus driver. Immediately, she was arrested. Almost overnight, the black community mobilized and began to boycott the city's buses. They demanded a change in the system. The individual who emerged as the leader of this boycott was a new minister who had just arrived in town. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. His goal was the complete integration of blacks into American society. His tactic was to use nonviolent protest. For about 1 year, members of the African American community refused to ride the city's segregated buses. Finally, in 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the segregation of the buses to be unconstitutional, and the city's buses were integrated. Overall, in the decade of the 1950s, we see the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. Individuals such as Rosa Parks and leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. began to make real progress as they chipped away at the Jim Crow and segregation laws which prevailed throughout the country. One final concept to be considered would be the other America. The label Other America comes from a book published in 1962 by Michael Harrington. He pointed out that not all Americans were members of this so-called Affluent Society. In 1962, 22% of the American population was at or below the poverty level. This translated to 35 million Americans. Many of those who were poor lived in decaying inner cities, while members of the new growing middle class fled the suburbs. Poverty rates among racial and ethnic minorities were higher than those for white families, and families headed by women and senior citizens also made up large numbers of the American poor. The acknowledgement of the high poverty rates in the nation would prompt one president to declare war on poverty in the 1960s. This was the final specific topic to be explored. We can now review some of the most important concepts addressed in the lecture. Well, American society following World War II was characterized by its affluence. This was seen in a variety of different ways. However, not all Americans participated in this prosperity. The start of the modern civil rights movement was seen with the Brown decision and the emergence of leaders like Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. Maybe you could evaluate some things here. Maybe you should try to determine which event or individual had the biggest impact on the United States during this era. Well, this concludes lecture number 12, the Affluent Society and Civil Rights. The next few slides will show hyperlinks to additional information as well as sources used for this lecture. Have a great day.